meant the metal spikes would be below freezing when driven into human flesh. The combination of puncture wounds and immediate cold metal contact caused muscles to seize and wounds to freeze, partially creating a unique form of agony, the sensation of being simultaneously stabbed and frozen from the inside out. Medieval torture inventories from 16th century Germany list spike benches as standard dungeon equipment, wooden platforms embedded with hundreds of sharp iron thorns protruding upward at various angles. Victims would be forced to sit or lie on these surfaces, while interrogators added weight to their bodies, driving the thorns deeper. Winter added another variable. The wooden benches would contract in cold temperatures, causing the embedded spikes to shift angles slightly, meaning even a motionless victim would experience continual micro-movements of the thorns inside their flesh. Torture session records describe victims who survived hours on these devices, blood freezing into icy streaks down the wooden sides, the cold actually slowing blood loss enough to prevent death while multiplying the pain. But perhaps no device captures the specific cruelty directed toward women better than the witch's bridal, also called the scold's bridle or branks. This was explicitly designed to punish women not for crimes, but for speaking, for having opinions, for defending themselves verbally. Historical records from Scotland and England document hundreds of cases where women were forced to wear these devices, and the winter months made them even more sadistic. The witch's bridle consisted of an iron framework that locked around the head with metal strips pressing against the skull. A spiked plate would be forced into the woman's mouth, with spikes designed to pierce the tongue if she attempted to speak. Some versions included additional spikes positioned to puncture the inside of the cheeks or the roof of the mouth. When these devices were stored in unheated spaces during winter, the metal would reach ambient temperatures well below freezing. Historical accounts from 17th century England describe women whose tongues froze to the metal plates inside the bridle, causing tissue death when the device was eventually removed. The iron bands pressing against the skull would conduct cold directly into the bone, causing severe headaches and, in prolonged cases, potential brain damage from cold exposure. Court records reveal women were sometimes forced to wear these devices for days at a time during winter, unable to eat, unable to drink, the metal growing colder each night, their own breath freezing into frost inside the cage around their mouth. And here's what makes this particularly revealing about historical power structures. The witch's bridle wasn't used for murderers or thieves. It was used for women who talked back, who argued, who refused to be silent. Historical records show it being applied to women who criticized their husbands, who disputed prices in the marketplace, who defended themselves against false accusations. This was about control, pure and simple, the violent enforcement of female silence through torture devices whose very design announced their purpose. Women would be paraded through town wearing the bridle, a public spectacle of humiliation that warned every other woman what awaited them if they dared to speak up. But if you think European torture methods were the pinnacle of historical cruelty, you need to understand what was happening simultaneously in colonial South America, where European sadism combined with tropical diseases and indigenous torture traditions to create something even more horrifying. The practice, called salted wounds, was particularly prevalent during the colonial period, used extensively on enslaved women, indigenous women, and any woman who resisted colonial authority. And while this might seem less relevant to winter conditions, understand that colonial records describe this torture being exported back to Europe and adapted for use in colder climates with devastating effect. The basic methodology was simple but excruciating. The victim would first be whipped or beaten, creating open wounds across their back, legs, arms, sometimes hundreds of lash marks covering their entire body. Then, while the wounds were still bleeding freely, coarse salt would be rubbed directly into the damaged tissue. If you've ever gotten salt in even a tiny cut, multiply that sensation by thousands, and you begin to approach what this felt like. The salt would cause immediate, explosive pain as it interacted with exposed nerve endings, but the real cruelty was what happened next. The salt would dehydrate the damaged tissue, causing wounds to crack open further. It would draw out bodily fluids, intensifying dehydration. And it would create a hostile environment that delayed healing for weeks or months. Historical medical analysis of colonial torture records reveals that salted wounds frequently became infected with deadly bacteria despite or perhaps because of the salt treatment. The victims would experience waves of pain lasting days, unable to move without reopening wounds, unable to sleep as their damaged skin rubbed against any surface. When this practice was adapted for European winter conditions, executioners discovered that the salt wound combination created a unique problem. The salt would draw moisture from the wounds, even as cold temperatures tried to freeze that same moisture. The result was a continuous cycle of partial freezing and thawing in the damaged tissue, essentially giving the victim repeated frostbite in their open wounds. Colonial records from 18th century South America describe women who survived this torture with permanent nerve damage, paralysis, and chronic pain that lasted decades. But we need to travel further east to understand the full spectrum of historical cruelty toward women, because some of the most methodical, calculated, and prolonged torture methods were developed in ancient and medieval China. Lingchi, often translated as death by 1,000 cuts, was a legal form of execution in China for over a millennium, and while it's often discussed in general terms, the specific application to women accused of crimes against the emperor or state reveals a level of systematic cruelty that demands examination. The execution would begin with the condemned woman being bound to a wooden post in a public square, completely immobilized with her arms and legs spread wide. The executioner would then begin making cuts, not random slashes, but methodical, measured incisions designed to inflict maximum pain while avoiding major blood vessels that would cause rapid death. Historical photographs from the late 19th century, yes, this practice continued until 1905, show the progression of these executions. The first cuts would be shallow, removing small pieces of skin from the limbs. Each cut carefully positioned to damage nerve endings without hitting arteries. The victim would remain fully conscious, fully aware, watching as pieces of their own body were systematically removed. As the execution progressed, the cuts would become deeper and more strategic. Chunks of muscle tissue would be removed from the thighs and upper arms areas with substantial tissue that could be carved away without immediately threatening life. The breasts would be systematically cut away. The executioner might remove fingers or toes joint by joint. All of this while the victim remained conscious, the pain building exponentially with each incision. Historical records describe Lingchi executions that lasted 3 days, with breaks overnight to allow the victim to survive until the next day's session. The winter months actually made this possible. Cold temperatures slowed blood loss and reduced the risk of infection, killing the victim prematurely. Chinese execution records reveal that Lingchi was specifically reserved for the most serious crimes: treason, killing one's parents, and for women. Adultery with a member of the imperial family, or conspiracy against the emperor. The public nature of the execution was crucial. Thousands would gather to witness the slow destruction of a human being, a deliberate demonstration of state power and the consequences of defiance. Medical historians analyzing the documented cases suggest victims of Lingchi likely experienced neurogenic shock in later stages, a condition where the nervous system becomes overwhelmed by pain signals, but historical accounts emphasize that executioners were skilled at maintaining consciousness throughout most of the procedure. And here's what's particularly chilling about studying these historical torture methods. They weren't aberrations or exceptions. They were normal, accepted, legally sanctioned practices that entire societies participated in, or at minimum, accepted as legitimate expressions of justice and social control. Women accused of adultery, women who spoke against authority, women who practiced non-sanctioned religions, women who inherited property that powerful men wanted, women who simply existed in ways that threatened patriarchal control, all were subject to these unimaginable tortures, often with the full support of legal systems, religious authorities, and community consensus. The winter months amplified all of these torture methods in ways that executioners deliberately exploited. Cold temperatures meant public executions drew larger crowds. People would gather around the spectacle for warmth as much as entertainment. Freezing conditions meant torture devices made of metal would inflict additional cold-based damage. Winter exposure meant victims already weakened by torture would succumb more quickly to hypothermia or frostbite, allowing executioners to maintain the legal fiction that the torture device itself wasn't what killed them, it was simply exposure to natural winter conditions. Historical records reveal a cynical calculus behind winter executions. They were more dramatic, more painful, more memorable, and provided legal cover through plausible deniability about the actual cause of death. These weren't distant, irrelevant historical curiosities. These practices persisted into the modern era. Lingchi continued until 1905. Public executions in Europe lasted into the 20th century, and echoes of these control mechanisms persist in various forms today. Understanding this history isn't about dwelling on past horrors for shock value. It's about recognizing how power structures have systematically used violence, particularly gendered violence, to maintain control. It's about understanding that the systematic dehumanization and torture of women wasn't aberrant behavior by a few sadistic individuals. It was normalized, legalized, and widely accepted practice across multiple cultures and centuries. Every torture method described here was once considered normal, acceptable, even righteous by the societies that practiced them. People gathered to watch these executions the way we might attend a sporting event. Children were brought to witness these horrors as lessons in obedience. Religious authorities blessed these practices as necessary for social order. And the victims, women whose names we'll never know, whose stories have been lost to history, except as footnotes in execution records, suffered unimaginable agony for crimes as trivial as speaking their minds or refusing unwanted advances. If these stories have affected you, if they've made you think differently about historical power structures and the systematic oppression of women throughout human history, then subscribe to Flow of History. We don't shy away from the brutal truths of our past, because understanding where we came from is essential to ensuring we never return to these darkest chapters of human civilization. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and join us as we continue exploring the uncomfortable, shocking, and essential truths about human history that deserve to be remembered, examined, and never repeated.